not meet with social media companies for the purpose of instructing them to take down content.
You have never had any meetings with the social media companies to discuss content moderation?
What we have done in the past, Ranking Member Paul, as I shared with you previously, is we, along with other federal agencies, have met with social media companies in a public-private partnership to speak of the threats to the homeland so that those companies are alert to them.
Do you think a threat to the homeland is a discussion of vaccine efficacy?
I do not.
That was Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas in a congressional hearing last week, appearing to try to equivocate with Congress about his department's involvement in censorship.
Though he and other heads of agencies have sought to deny that they played any role in forcing social media companies to censor content, some members of the independent media point out that, well, they've lied. Michael Shellenberger, one such voice, writes, quote, "The directors of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security say they didn't violate the First Amendment by demanding censorship, but they did, and their recent statements before Congress suggest not only that they did, but also that they are scared of those consequences coming home." Here to discuss these most recent developments and this congressional testimony from Alejandro Mayorkas is Michael Shellenberger himself. He's co-author of Public Substack. Great to have you back with us, Michael.
Good to be with you guys.
So you see how that conversation goes. Mayorkas and other officials who are caught in this same situation will say, no, of course we didn't do censorship. Of course we didn't tell the social media companies to take down content. And then they're asked for clarification, and they say, well, we had a lot of meetings where we laid out the stakes and the potential consequences for this content existing, but then we let them do what they were going to do. Is that persuasive?
Not at all. And I thought the hearing was really revelatory. I mean, I should hasten to say that the Censorship Industrial Complex is fully intact. It's still fully funded. We have by no means won this, but it does feel like something's shifted, that we're on the front foot. You know, as you guys know, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the Missouri versus Biden case, which is one of the biggest First Amendment cases in U.S. history. I was just reading a new book out called Liar in a Crowded Theater, which Reason actually wrote a review of, or had an excerpt of, which is by a very liberal author making the case against the kind of activities that we have seen over the last several years. And then you saw in that clip you just showed, and there's much more of it, where Senator Paul was grilling the heads of FBI and DHS, and I think generously you would say them being misleading. I think more strongly you could say that they were lying about what those two agencies had done. DHS had set up a special public-private partnership to basically demand censorship. I think that's a fair way to say it, on both so-called election misinformation and on COVID information. And FBI, of course, was involved in one of the most notorious disinformation campaigns in recent memory, which was around priming social media companies to think that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation and encouraged the censorship which occurred by both Twitter and Facebook. So I think that what we see now is some officials recognizing that the tide has turned in a very, I think, clear way, and the public doesn't want this kind of censorship, that we're going to likely see, I hope anyway, a positive ruling from the Supreme Court against these kind of activities, and just other signs in the air, including the book I just mentioned that just came out last week. And I think other shifts in the media that suggest that the public really doesn't want the government involved in the ways that it's been involved in supposedly combating misinformation.
Michael, do you think there's ever a role for Homeland Security Department or any other department entrusted with the security of Americans to be in contact at all with any social media company? Should this be a blanket ban of any communication, or is there something that exists that would be rightly characterized as being in the sincere national security interests of the public?
I mean, I think certainly for illegal speech, then I strongly favor the government being involved in all the ways that we know that they are involved in terms of, child, pornography and, other illegal forms of speech. Those should definitely continue to be policed. I think that when it comes to things like election misinformation, people have made the case that the government has an obligation to sort of reach out to social media companies and encourage them to censor false information that would basically deprive people of their right to vote. However, Jeff Kosseff in his new book, Liar in a Crowded Theater, which is a really important book, I think, and I'll be writing about it myself, he argues that those kinds of warnings really should happen publicly. It should not happen behind the scenes, and that really counter speech is the right approach. The government should tell people, hey, there's people spreading misinformation about when the elections are and whether you can vote by mail and whether the voting machines are safe, and that those things are best done publicly. Arguably much more effectively as well, I should say. But that getting into the business of privately working with social media companies to censor this information, or getting involved in these issues of election disputes. I mean, we've seen both Stacey Abrams in Georgia and obviously President Donald Trump engage in election skepticism or election denialism depending on your point of view. That's part of free speech, is claiming, perhaps falsely, that you did not lose the election. And also, the book is very interesting because the history of this is that, in fact, the Supreme Court has upheld people deliberately lying in some cases around, and that being protected speech. It's so in the case, the kind of the obsession that people have with that you're not allowed to cry fire in a crowded theater, it turns out to be much more complicated than that. And basically, you see a lot of people basically attempting to suggest that things are imminent or that there's imminent violence or some sort of imminent threat, when in reality you can see it's just been a kind of expansion of the definitions of things that people want to see censored. So feels a little bit like the fever has broken in terms of this kind of crazed obsession with censoring so-called misinformation. But I think that we're going to revert back to where we were maybe pre-2020, hopefully in the next year or so.
Yeah, the fire in a crowded theater example, you're right, it gets misused all the time, even by a lot of people who ought to know better. From the original, with the Supreme Court decision on that, or where that quote comes from, that was taking the view that people couldn't pass out leaflets opposing U.S. entry into World War I. Like that was the fire was harming the public's appetite for involvement in World War I was the recklessness of yelling fire in a crowded theater, which obviously even you can take out the social media aspect of this today. Most people, and certainly our Supreme Court, would argue that of course we actually have a very First Amendment affirming Supreme Court. We've had a lot of cases since then where people saying hateful and wrong and bad things have been allowed to do that. I think it's totally uncontroversial to say today's Supreme Court would say you have every right to distribute leaflets opposing entrance into a war, that you can't, if there's literally a fire, you can yell fire in a crowded theater, right? There are cases where such speech is called for. So it's become a very tortured metaphor, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're exactly right. I mean, reading this book, I knew some of the history, but this book really pulls it together specifically in the context of these debates around mis and disinformation. And the author goes through just all these recent examples, including, as you said, by people that know better. I mean, Cass Sunstein had a book that came out a few years ago where he was calling for the government to have a kind of special committee involved in censoring things. I mean, perfectly smart people coming up with just awful ideas that are really against the American tradition of not having a government regulator of speech. The courts have protected very high standards of free speech. I spent a fair amount of time in Europe and Britain over the last year, and it's just shocking, what, the kind of restrictions on speech in Europe. And you're reminded why our forefathers wanted a country that had the First Amendment protecting free speech and free expression, because the temptation to censor others is just so strong, particularly in a time of such high political passions and political partisanship. So I do think that it's taken, we've been in this fever a little bit on this issue, or a trance. I do see it starting to break. There's still a lot of work to be done. Obviously, we're hoping for a Supreme Court ruling. The Congress needs to defund these organizations, including through National Science Foundation, another kind of sleeper issue on the censorship front that people should pay attention to. But National Science Foundation has been funding, I think it's $66 million worth of basically censorship research activities aimed at, encouraging more censorship by social media platforms. So there's just a lot of bad stuff has accumulated that we have to get rid of. But boy, it sure feels like the mood has shifted, that something has changed in the culture. These are, even Obama, I noticed, who I criticized for giving a speech last year about fighting mis and disinformation, has sort of moved on to other issues. I feel like we're at least on the front foot, or something has changed. So I'm in an optimistic mood, though obviously there's a lot of work still to be done.
There was a new Twitter files, I believe, on Friday from a reporter, Susan Schmidt, who showed that more examples of government outreach to the social media company is flagging accounts, accusing them of Russian bots. This is separate from the Hamilton 68 letter, whatever it was called, a different list of Russian bots, and you can see the internal Twitter communications where Yoel Roth goes, nope, that's American, that's authentic, no, they're just wrong, and I mean
right.
That's part of the problem, right? It's not just that the government ought not to do this; it's that the assertions it made about the content in some cases were factually inaccurate.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think that, so first of all, I think the other big change that maybe undiscussed here, but we've discussed in the past, is obviously Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, now X, has just, I think, had a big impact, because so much of these demands for censorship were being made through Twitter and Facebook. Facebook is still censoring like crazy. But the difference is that it's just not the same platform that it was a few years ago in terms of being a source for news. I should also say, in the sort of depressing direction, you may have seen that Pew came out with a survey results recently that Nate Silver wrote about too, about rising support among Democrats for censorship. I mean, it's just completely shocking. Like between 2018 and 2023, a big increase in demand. So there's definitely an organic desire for more censorship, even more depressing, greater support for censorship among young people. And so you sort of see a kind of relentless demand, but it does feel like there's now some consequences being dragged in front of Congress, being criticized publicly for people that are demanding censorship. So hopefully there's we would hope to see the institutions, DHS, FBI, Congress, the news media, starting to pay a price for demanding censorship, and then that being a way to push back against some of these organic demands from the culture. But it's a cliche, but it's one that I feel like I've really learned personally, which is just that if you care about free speech, it's not something that you can take. You can't take your eye off that ball. You got to stay focused on it. You got to keep defending it, because the temptation, the desire for censorship appears to be very strong in people, as we have seen on the Israel-Palestine issue, on both the left and the right. It's a very strong impulse.
Yeah.
Michael, to that end, you mentioned that Facebook is still censoring like crazy, and there's this allusion to the new Twitter files. And my understanding is that we're not actually getting anything new still from Twitter and Elon Musk after his public break with Matt Taibbi and earlier Bari Weiss. Do we have any disclosures that would give us a sense of what the current Twitter policies are internally? Is there any transparency there?
I mean, we have seen certainly, I think the biggest change has been community notes, and that becoming where all the action is at. I testified in front of the Senate a few weeks ago in support of user control of content moderation. This is where you basically, when you sign up for a platform, you be able to choose your filters. If you want to choose, the Rising's filters, you could. If you want to choose Anti-Defamation League's filters, you could. I noticed that in this new book I keep touting, that he also calls for user control, as does the founder of TechCrunch, who's somebody that I have had disagreements with publicly. And Elon has said publicly that that's the direction that he wants to be moving in, is greater control over content. But yeah, I've only seen what you've seen on it. In terms of the new Twitter files, I think Sue Schmidt's thread last week was excellent. It really did covered something that hadn't been covered quite before, but it is still that same group of people: Renee DiResta, the New Knowledge people, the folks that actually operated bot accounts in an Alabama 2017 Senate race. So, there's just not a bunch of stuff there that's new. I've had various folks, including some Germans, have been asking to know more about what happened. And I think for me personally, I've just sort of felt like given all the demands for censorship by the European Union, by the British government, in Ireland, in Brazil, in Canada, I feel like I personally have sort of moved on. I'm always interested in more things that people find, but it just feels like there's so many pressing demands for censorship, particularly outside the United States, that I think I have not made a priority of going back to the Twitter files.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. I like that tie, by the way.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you guys.